and how it's used and how you protect yourselves and so forth. One of the things we just talked about, table salt, the toxicity of table salt. It's really interesting that many of the PCB formulations that people are so tremendously concerned about now with all of these transformer blow-ups and so forth and exposure to tiny amounts of PCBs, most of the PCB formulations are less acutely toxic than table salt.
How far should we go in trying to control trace levels of toxic substances? Could we find ourselves placing a hazardous warning label on every salt shaker in America? Well, while there are some who may urge us to do just that, most scientists concerned with food and food production are trying to promote a more balanced view. Let's meet one of them. At the International Center for the Improvement of Maize and Wheat in Texcoco, Mexico, is Dr. Norman Borlaug. He's one of the world's leading experts on food and crop production. He's won the Nobel Peace Prize. An agricultural scientist, he breeds new strains of corn and wheat to help feed people in developing countries around the world. Dr. Borlaug talks about the use of agricultural chemicals.
Today we have this chemophobia that seems to have come into the picture mostly in the last 20 years. This fear of chemicals, anything that's synthetic. And so it is with pesticides. They have to be used with precaution, and the labels show you how to use them. There has been a great deal of legislation passed in the last 10 or 15 years which puts more restrictions on their use, and this I think is good. But on the other hand, if it's done in excess, then it disarms all of us who are trying to work to produce more food. We can't win the battle against hunger. In other words, we can't win the battle of food production if you take away all of our armaments. If we went back to the pre-agricultural chemical era of the early 1930s and tried to produce the crop of 1980, it would take us an additional land area equivalent to all of the land east of the Mississippi River, except for that of Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan. Now we try to increase the levels or to add others through genetic manipulation. But by so doing, we are also dealing with chemical compounds. We need to go back to our junior high schools and high schools and give them the broad education, how all of these things are linked together, including the proper use of chemicals, both for medicinal purposes, for agricultural purposes, for industrial purposes.
The Survey Research Center, University of California at Berkeley. Dr. Aaron Wadowski is professor of political science and public policy. His specialty is risk and safety. Wadowski points to the dangers of chasing down non-risks.
Take the glass of chlorine. Chlorine forms chloroform, which is a weak carcinogen. If you drink a glass of Berkeley tap water or any other tap water treated with chlorine, you're getting a carcinogenic substance. Why do we use chlorine? Because given all the bad things that can get into water against which chlorine protects, the small harm it does is well worth taking. You go out to the Silicon Valley and then you see big headlines. Silicon Valley water wells contaminated. But because these are wells, they have no chlorine. They do have other poisons, oh yes, but these poisons are in such low concentrations, they are far less than you would get in a glass of chlorinated water. Now you're going to drive everybody crazy by trying to get these tiny trace amounts out, or are you going to say, if it's got a lot less than a glass of water, I don't have to worry about it, but are there other things that are potentially much more dangerous that I ought to worry about? When you lack discrimination as a matter of policy, when you accuse the people in power and business of trying to poison you for parts per billion, quadrillion, so tiny we only recently learned how to measure them, if you insist on being crazy, then there's no point in saying that our government is not intelligent because it spends so much time and effort warding off shadows, it doesn't have the opportunity that it would like to take to use its money to ward off or ameliorate the greatest dangers.
Everyone supports the regulation of toxic chemicals, their manufacture, disposal, and use. However, as we've seen, there is growing unease among the scientific community that in our desire to eliminate all risk, no matter how slight, things are getting out of hand. In our efforts to rid our environment of traces of chemicals, are we diverting attention away from real health risks? Let's ask a doctor of science in public health, Dr. Elizabeth Whelan of the American Council on Science and Health in New York City. Dr. Whelan is among a growing number of scientists who fear that overstating the risk of environmental chemicals is actually threatening the health of Americans and putting in jeopardy our enviable standard of living. She is very concerned about priorities.
My concern about inverted priorities is really twofold here. First, when Americans begin focusing on non-risks, they have less time to worry about things that really matter. I'm reminded of a neighbor of mine who recently expressed her great concern about the safety of applesauce. She said, "I'm not giving my child applesauce because I heard there are some chemicals in it that might cause cancer." And I tried to reassure her that this was simply not an issue to be concerned about. But the next morning I saw her with this young child on the back of her bicycle, riding on a sandy road with no helmet on the child. Now this is a real risk, a risk of perhaps developing epilepsy for life from a head injury, not having a helmet on. I think Americans are so numbed by constant warnings about things being hazardous that they've become unable to distinguish among those things that are important and separate out those that are not. Because the more we learn about the causes of human disease, the more we realize we cannot pass laws and ask government to act on our behalf. The more we learn, the more we realize that we largely determine our own fate, that lifestyle factors play an enormous role in premature disease and death. It's time to begin focusing on those and to spend less of our limited time chasing down non-risks like trace levels of chemicals in our environment.
What these scientists are telling us is that there is a vast difference between what we are most afraid of and what actually is doing the most damage to our health. Now, that doesn't mean we should relax our vigilance toward protecting the environment. We must do our utmost to preserve it for our children and our children's children. But public health priorities are a different matter. In looking for the causes of premature disease and death, society does not have to find its culprit in parts per billion of a synthetic organic molecule. The real threats to public health are much simpler, more familiar things. Cigarette smoking, poor dietary habits, drug and alcohol abuse, unsafe sexual behavior, even failing to fasten our seatbelts or use a smoke detector. It takes courage to hold up our modern myths to the mirror of truth. And looking for something or someone to blame, we've been searching around unable to see our own reflection. The hard fact is that most of society's suffering from toxicity or disease is self-inflicted and personally avoidable. Bruce Ames has perhaps a more positive view.
I mean, the one really striking thing about the modern world is we're the healthiest we've ever been in human history. Life expectancy gets longer every year, and it's not just infant mortality. Every year it gets longer. We're living into our 80s now. In fact, smoking is 8 years off your life, and if people weren't smoking, life expectancy would be well into their 80s. And every year it gets longer, and I'm convinced it's going to get longer faster than people think, because modern biology is going like a rocket. People are figuring out causes of cancer, and it's going to be mainly these lifestyle factors and dietary things, and they're figuring out causes of heart disease, cholesterol and saturated fat and all of that. And so we're so healthy, and yet people are worrying and worrying and worrying. It's, in the end, it comes down to what your mother told you. Just moderation in all things, don't overdo anything and you'll be fine. Don't smoke, don't drink too much, and moderation, and don't worry.
For the American Council on Science and Health, I'm Walter Cronkite.